Time for Views on the News, and here to give his 2 cents is Matt Driskill, a senior editor at Reuters News. Good to have you back with us, Matt, as always. Now let's start with efforts down under to curb terrorism. The Today Online carries the headline, "Australia plans to regulate travel to terrorism hotbeds," stating that visiting designated countries without valid reason could become a criminal offence. The Sydney Morning Herald will tell you how seriously the Prime Minister is about it. Their headline reads, "Tony Abbott boosts funding by $630 million to fight homegrown terrorism." This is echoed by the Australian Online, with the government to tighten anti-terrorism laws. The first line of this article reads, "The federal government has dropped changes to the Racial Discrimination Act as it seeks community cooperation to tackle homegrown terrorism." Matt, they're getting very serious about this down under, worried about Australians, born and bred Australians, fighting in wars overseas and then bringing back these sort of militant ideologies.
Well, when I first got this, I was having my coffee this morning. You guys had sent me the links to the stories, and I was looking at that, and I had to think for a minute before the coffee had kicked in. I'm thinking, you know, how much terrorism is actually affecting Australia. I thought the last time they were attacked by terrorists was in a Tom Cruise Mission Impossible movie. I think it was MI2 or something, I'm not sure. But, you know, the threat is real, and Australia is not the only country that has had citizens that have traveled to Syria or Iraq or other places where, you know, these conflicts are going on. So they do face the threat of, you know, radicalized people coming back, they call them. I would say that if they're actually looking to use this as a step to defeat terrorism or cure these people from their ways of wanting to do bad, that it's going to be a failed effort, because terrorism is always going to be around. You're never going to get rid of it.
It's a global fight anyway, isn't it? It's not just protecting Australia, but tackling terrorism worldwide.
Well, it's a global fight, and again, it's something that's always going to be around. Terrorism has been around as long as the human race has been around, and it will be around as long as we are around. It's not going to go away. You take, for example, you know, in the United States throughout history, you had Lyndon Johnson with the war on poverty. Still got poor people. You had Richard Nixon with the war on crime. Still got crime. You've had every president since Nixon with the war on drugs. You still have drug problems. So the war on terror is going to be going on as long as the human race exists.
But let's talk about the timing of these new proposals, because it says in the article as well that there are an estimated 150 Australians that have fought with radical militants in Syria and Iraq. Perhaps not such an enormous number when you think about it, but so what's behind the reason for introducing these measures now?
Well, I could be very cynical and say that it's simply a power grab by the government, because I forget who it was that said, "Never let a crisis go to waste." And, you know, I think it may have been someone in the United States working for the U.S. government. But when you have these kinds of situations going on, you will have governments that will take full advantage of it. You look at what happened in the United States.
After 9/11.
The National Security Agency, the Patriot Act, all of these things. And again, the cynical side of me says, well, it is simply a government power grab so that the government gets more money, the police get more money. And you look at war on drugs, for example, the only two entities that make money off the war on drugs are the criminals and the cops. And that's it, and that's the truth. So the war on terror, the people that are getting the power are the government, of course. And it's not just the Australian government, it's the British government. You look at the amount of spying that they're doing on their own citizens that have not been convicted or even suspected of doing anything wrong, but they're being spied on by the government. Like, little history lesson here, if you read your classics, if you read Plato, Plato warned thousands of years ago against kings and tyrants, because they will always create enemies so that the people will need their king. And this is a little bit of that. But again, granted, Australia, they do face problems just like every other country faces problems. But I'm a little bit cynical that it is such a huge problem that they need to change the laws in such a way. And I'll give you an example for that reason. I did a little research. From 1972 to 1986, they had 5 cases of so-called terrorism. Every other case that they've had since then, which was about 7 or 8, There was a Sydney hotel bombing, a couple of other things that went on, some people that were planning attacks. Those were all handled by the courts with the laws that were on the books at that time. This was earlier, this was 5, 6 years ago. And right now there's probably, according to the research, very quick research I did, there are about 70 to 80 cases that are under investigation. So again,
you put it all in perspective, it seems small, but it is a preventive measure, they're saying. What's controversial, though, is the plans to store the phone and internet records of Australians will be included.
I also think confiscating people's passports if they intend to travel to these countries without giving a specific reason.
Yeah, additional powers given to police and intelligence agencies.
Well, and that's where I have a problem, because you have this, you know, and again, it's around the world, but the no-fly list, for example, in the United States, anybody could be put on that list. We had a professor in Malaysia who was put on the no-fly list, and nobody would tell her why. She had to go to federal court to get her name off the list, and the government said, oh, it's a state secret. We can't tell you why you're on the list. So it's all, my problem is either you're a nation of the rule of law or you're not. And when a country is able to do these things without convicting you of a crime, without even charging you with a crime, so that you're able to defend yourself, I think that's wrong.
Okay, that's where the danger is. Let's move on to our next story.
Speaking about the rule of law.
One story that has been making headlines globally, we've been talking about it this morning already. Bernie Ecclestone apparently says he's an idiot for paying £60 million or $100 million to settle his F1 bribery trial. The Guardian reports that while relieved, the Formula One boss questions paying the amount, as the judge more or less said he was acquitted. Now, the defence says he didn't buy his freedom. Do you agree with that?
Oh, he bought it. He bought and paid for it, and it cost him, you know, however many, $100 million settlement. But again, we were talking about, you know, F1 and all that before we go on the air, and I'm not a huge race fan. I don't sit there and watch the cars go round and round the track. But as I said before, I really like the pageantry and the color of people like Bernie, because he's a colorful guy, he's got a colorful family, he's rich. Everybody, you know, it's a great story. Everybody likes those kinds of stories.
You're painting a very good picture of this man who was about to go on trial.
You know, any rich person who hasn't had legal problems or hasn't had to pay legal fees is not that rich.
Possibly not legal fees quite as big as this, though. $100 million we're talking about.
Well, and my only question is, because my mother was a lawyer, my eldest brother was a lawyer, so I used to cover the courts in the States. My only question is, why didn't he pay this earlier and avoid, you know, probably several $1 million worth of legal fees?
And he said the trial, well, it's been going on for quite some time, and it's taking time out of him running F1 as well. Well, it's cost him in that way.
And it's just the legal fees. I mean, I know, you know, from my business coverage and things like that, I know companies that do everything they can to avoid what they call the courthouse steps. Nobody wants to go to court, because the only people that win in court are the lawyers. They get paid whether you win, whether they lose or win the case. They get paid. And the lawyers are the only ones that win in this case. The state, the prosecutors to a certain extent as well, because now they've got $100 million of Bernie's money, and he gets to walk away. Did he buy, you know, to me, yeah, when I was reading the story this morning, it's like, well, you bribed the court to get rid of the bribery charge.
That's what most people are commenting on.
I mean, no doubt he paid his way out of it, but what does it say about the German courts? I mean, what does it say about the legal system, particularly because the person he supposedly bribed is behind bars now?
Yeah, I think he was supposed to, Bernie was supposed to have paid him $44 million or something like that, which is, that's a pretty good bribe, actually. That's a nice chunk of money. I was reading, actually it was interesting, it's a good question, because I was reading this, and in the court system in Germany, apparently it is a lot more easy to pay to settle some of these cases, even criminal cases. Now, you know, again, I'm more familiar with the court system in the United States for several reasons, but you can settle certain cases, obviously paying fines or paying settlements.
If it's in the interest of the state.
You look at the big banks, you know, that have settled charges of helping Iran launder money and things like that, and they've paid, you know, $9 billion. JP Morgan paid $10 billion for the housing fraud or whatever it was. So, you know, it happens, and it happens frequently, and they pay it without admitting guilt or whatever. And it's, I guess, you know, to a certain extent, it's the same way in Germany.
One of the reasons given was perhaps suggesting that his age, like he was going to be too old to go to prison, and that was a...
Well, it seems a bit pointless if they can take $100 million off him.
Yes.
Well, and Bernie doesn't strike me as an invalid or anyone who's lost a step just because of his age. He seems to be doing pretty well for 83, I think.
All right, well, we do have to move on to our final story. This one which caught our attention on Channel News Asia's website. Computer games may ease elderly depression. According to a new study, brain-boosting games may be as effective as drugs in treating severe depression. What do you make of that, Matt?
I think it's very interesting. It's, I'm sure that the pharmaceutical companies don't want to read this because, you know, that's antidepressants and drugs of those nature. That's a huge moneymaker.
Well, the console makers will be very happy.
The console makers will be very happy. You know, whoever came up with Tetris, I think was the name of that one game.
Tetris,
where you,
yes.
Tetris,
with the bricks.
You have to do the bricks in certain ways. Which actually, I mean, you know, I can see how it does that. I've tried to play Halo and so another game with my son, who's 10 years old, and he's way ahead of me on that. I can't keep up with everything. But I think it's very interesting. I think, again, if...
It doesn't surprise you, though, really, the findings, does it?
No, it doesn't. You know, it's one of the key things to, you know, and I don't want to have a senior moment here and forget what I'm going to say, but, you know, you need to stay active, you need to stay engaged. You know, countless studies have been done that people as they get older, if they, you know, I mean, my father worked for 50 years. He could have retired, you know, a long time ago, but he worked at the same job because he loved it. He was engaged in it. It kept him, you know, young in certain ways, and certainly kept his brain active and all of that. So the more you can keep your brain active, the more, you know, study another language. That's also been said to, you know, help keep your brain active and keep the old gray matter turning over.
Okay, so if you don't have that great coordination then on computer games, you can
it doesn't have to be, you know, so much hand-eye coordination. There's others, you know, other ways, you know, brain teasers, crossword puzzles, things like that. I do that every morning just to make sure I'm okay.
That's why you're so sharp.
All right, well, that is all we've got time for this morning. Many thanks indeed for that. Matt Driskill from Reuters News, and it's business news coming up next. We've got a preview of Asian trade, plus Rupert Murdoch withdraws his bid from Time Warner. The details when we return.